This is the second presentation in my series on defending Australia. It is a reload as the first variant actually had problems with the sound. This presentation links to the discussion of geographic scale at the heart of part 1 by looking at the structural weaknesses in the organisation, plans and weapons of the ADF in defending Australia. Let's start off with the great weakness of the Australian Defence Force. It's Western. That is not a suggestion that our Navy, Air Force or Army does not have some of the finest weapons available. In general they do, but unfortunately for Australia they are built for the wrong battlefield. Once more, it's geographic scale that is the problem, but this time we'll look at the impact upon the actual weapons used. As an example, this is a Virginia-class submarine. Australia is looking to obtain Virginia-class submarines sometimes in the 2030s, simply because it will take so long for Australia to develop the industrial capacity it needs to build its own AUKUS submarines. The Virginia-class submarines, as impressive as they are, actually consist of 5 variants known as blocks. Block 5, as an example, have vertical launch systems, also known as VLS, for delivering an incredible amount of firepower. It has nearly 3 times as many Tomahawk missiles as the earlier blocks. However, it is unknown what block the Royal Australian Navy will receive. Given the needs of the United States, the RAM will undoubtedly receive submarines from the older blocks. Note that all of Block 1 submarines and several from Block 2 were actually commissioned about the same time as our Collins-class submarines. Depending on upgrades, the number of missiles these earlier blocks can launch is significantly less than the later blocks. We now need to look at the areas the United States Navy planned to use their Virginia-class submarines. Originally, they were for the North Atlantic, close to their major bases and their impressive submarine detection systems, as well as a substantial number of ASW aircraft. Their main hunting ground for Russian submarines would be the line known as the Greenland-Iceland-UK Gap, which is an arc of nearly 2,000 kilometres. The United States Navy and the Royal Navy have nearly 30 submarines to patrol this line, plus submarines from France, Canada and Norway. In comparison, the Royal Australian Navy will sometime after 2040 have 10 submarines to cover double the distance of the GIUK Gap. The next Pacific battlefield for the American submarines is probably the waters of the Taiwanese Strait. The distance is roughly 250 kilometres. And only one of the maritime approaches to Australia is through the gap between the islands of Timor and northwestern Australia. When overlaid, you can see the latter is double the length. Let's now look at ships' capabilities in the waters around Timor. This is our Collins-class submarine patrolling the gap. The circle represents the range of its Harpoon anti-ship missiles. Its guided torpedoes have a significantly smaller range. The new Tomahawk missiles will have a range of over 1,500 kilometres, but the Collins-class submarines cannot use them. The 5 Collins-class submarines replacements will only start to enter service sometime in the mid-2030s. Let's add another complicating factor for naval combat. The Royal Australian Navy's missiles lack range. This is the location of a patrolling frigate or destroyer. The range of the obsolete but still impressive Harpoon missiles is shown by the inner circle. The new missiles being acquired for the Royal Australian Navy are a Norwegian design. This increases the range of its anti-ship missiles to 250 kilometres, which is the next circle. There are 2 very simple reasons for these short ranges. The first is the US Navy's magnificent supercarriers. A relatively short-range anti-ship missile, such as a Harpoon, is irrelevant if you load them onto a plane, which can then take part in a mass attack launched from a carrier with as many fighter bombers as the entire RAAF. Obviously, the Royal Australian Navy does not have, nor ever will have, a supercarrier. The second reason why the Norwegian missiles have a short range in comparison to the Chinese is that they are going to fight the Russian Navy in the Barents, Norwegian or Baltic Seas. Distances between major land masses for the Norwegians are from 700 to 1,000 kilometres in the Atlantic, which is dominated by the US Navy and Royal Navy submarines, while in the Baltic, distances from any Scandinavian country to its eastern shoreline is only about 200 kilometres. Why is the range of these missiles important? Let's go back to the Timor Sea. The Chinese missiles have a far greater range, which is about double the Royal Australian Navy's new missiles. With the Chinese warship having a strike range of 500 kilometres, an Australian frigate would take at least 4 hours sailing from when the Chinese could launch the missiles to when it could launch its own. And that is provided the Chinese stay still and provided the Navy can actually locate the Chinese ships. There is a similar problem with deploying the RAAF. It has bare bases across northern Australia to which it will relocate its fighter squadrons in an emergency. Since this presentation was made, the government has announced that they will upgrade the bare bases and has provided initial seed funding to do so, but the total funding is still not in the budget, and it is a little unclear when these upgrades will be completed. Until they're completed, the problem is that there is nothing there. No ground defence units, air defence units, technicians, fuel or ammunition. Everything requires transport from Eastern Australia, not a small feat in itself. First would come the ground defence units, then the air defence, then the technicians needed to keep the planes in the air, and then enough fuel and ammunition for the fighters to at least protect their bases. Nor are the F-35s purchased by Australia suitable for fast redeployment. There are actually three variants of the F-35. The F-35C is designed for carrier-based operations. The F-35B is the V-style variant, which is suitable for redeployment to quickly prepared temporary airfields or existing small civilian airfields. Instead, Australia has the F-35A, which must use established airfields, hence the need to deploy to the bare bases with their permanent airfields. Of course, while the RAAF is readying the bare bases and then getting the aircraft into position, the deployment is reliant upon the Chinese doing nothing. Apparently, they will not use special forces, sub-launched missiles, or even air attack to prevent or delay the build-up. Instead, China will salute us with a jovial wave as they welcome the RAAF fighters going into position to attack Chinese ships, planes, or troops. Without labouring the point, the F-35 is made for the distances associated with European battlefields. The 500 rule remains a reasonable measure of combat range. In high-intensity combat, its range is about 500 kilometres, represented by the inner circle centred on RAAF Tyndall. In a bomb run against a relatively undefended target, its combat range is about 1,000 kilometres, represented by the second circle. The final circle is the F-35's ferry range, carrying no weaponry, of about 2,000 kilometres. In comparison, the Chinese stealth fighters, developed for Pacific conditions, have about the same range as the F-35's ferry range, or about 2,000 kilometres. While debate will continue about the relative merits of the planes, their combat ranges make for an interesting comparison. The major Australian Army base is now in Townsville. Under the DSR, it will be for the home for almost all of its heavy equipment. Should the Chinese obtain a base in Port Moresby, their stealth fighters would have the range to easily bomb the only significant Army unit in Australia. The RAAF F-35s, operating from its closest bases at RAAF Tyndall or Amberley, do not have the range to defend the Army, which now brings us to in-flight refueling. Major General Molan, in his book Danger on Our Doorstep, notes the vulnerability of the tankers used for in-flight refueling and the major risk it creates for air operations. Quite simply, the greater the reliance on in-flight refueling for any operation, the greater the risk, as is the need to deploy RAAF planes to defend the tankers. Marcus Hellyer also did an excellent series of articles for ASPI on the RAAF F-35s. In order to provide fighter protection to defend a distant site, he noted some of the risks with using in-flight refueling, and he gave a maximum combat range of 1,500 kilometres for the F-35s with the using in-flight refueling. He also explained how many resources are required to keep them on station. Due to transit time, maintenance and refueling, for the RAAF to provide permanent protection for the Army base at Townsville or any nearby naval force of just 2 patrolling F-35s would require 12 to 16 F-35s, all the available Wedgetails, and an absolute minimum of 4 to 5 tankers for in-flight refueling. Of course, the Chinese also have in-flight refueling, and that still leaves them with a greater range using less of their vulnerable tankers. In fact, using just one air refueling point on the way in and another on the way back enables the Chinese to attack the major RAAF bases from Port Moresby. This potential means even more RAAF planes are diverted to just defending their own bases. Let's go back to the bare bases. In my book, I refer to these bases as a strategic risk, and I use the example of the Malami airfield during the Battle for Crete in 1941. The distance from bases in southern China to RAAF Curtin is about 4,500 kilometres. The distance from the RAAF bases in the east over 3,000 kilometres. Without American intervention, the Chinese actually have the resources to develop these bases faster than the RAAF. Then comes the Army. It lacks enough self-propelled artillery, attack helicopters, or any significant air defence. The design of its current infantry vehicles precedes the Vietnam War, while the number of new Redbacks being purchased will actually reduce the existing number of IFVs by 2/3. In the event of any significant incursion, even using the RAAF's impressive air transport capability, it would still take upwards of 10 days to develop the bare bases, get the RAAF fighters on site, and get an assault brigade into position. The Royal Australian Navy is also not without problems. Like the Army, its ships' complements are well trained and well led. Strangely, it does not have command of Australia's most powerful ASW assets, which are the Poseidons. Its Anzac frigates and Collins-class submarines are based on 50-year-old designs. As I've noted, it will be in the mid-2030s before replacements are received for these vehicles. Or, rather than vehicles, vessels. The two largest ships in the Royal Australian Navy are the Canberra-class amphibious ships. They have a ramp that is theoretically capable of launching the V-style aircraft, which is the F-35B, the variant that Australia does not have. As I've noted, the F-35A, our plane, is unable to use this ramp. Most commentators, including Hugh White, upon whose theories the DSR is based, do not believe the Canberra-class, by far the largest ships in the Royal Australian Navy, are suitable for Australia's needs. Then the DSR was released in April 2023. Any coherent Australian defence strategy collapsed. Instead, Australia no longer pretends we have a sound policy for defending Australia. In fact, over the next 10 years, the combat strength of the ADF will decline quite dramatically. Instead of any strategy, we have a procurement policy that will not provide any significant increase in Australia's combat assets before 2035, even perhaps by then. Here are a few books and websites that people interested in Australia's defence may find useful. The first is, naturally, my book. It looks at the ADF's structural weaknesses in greater depth, the excessive cost of Australia's defence, and the failure of debate over Australia's strategic policy. Hugh White's book, How to Defend Australia, was written in 2019. It is a must-read. It explains the Defence Strategic Review better than the report explains itself. And honestly, they should have just referred to him and let him have the royalties. General Molan's book, Danger on Our Doorstep, is an interesting description of Australia within a Greater Pacific War from a retired and respected Major General. His death was a tragedy for any non-conformist analysis of Australian defence policy. There is also the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. It publishes consistently strong analysis on defence issues facing Australia. Anybody interested in Australian defence policy should register for their free newsletter, podcast and online presentations. Since this presentation was done, I would also refer you to the website for Strategic Analysis Australia. It is well worthwhile, and perhaps it is becoming even more impressive than ASPI.